So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Today we have the pleasure to have Rens Claerhoudt. He is currently a PhD researcher at Tilburg Law School in the University of Tilburg University in the Netherlands. He will be talking with us today. He will be presenting his research in the legal protection of animal parasites in international biodiversity law. Rens, thank you so much for being here today with us. And you can start now. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you. Very excited to do this, and special thanks to Veerle, of course, for inviting me. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is basically what I've also written down in my paper, in my article, and it's the findings of the first half of my PhD project. I'm now halfway, 2 more years to go. And basically, this is what I'd like to talk about. So I want to say something about how I got to this project, this idea. Then I want to define or describe what parasites are, or at least how I treat what I consider to be parasites. And then I'll say something about why they are ecologically important and why they are threatened with extinction. And then I turn to the law, more specifically the international biodiversity law, talking about what their current position there is. And I will end with some open questions, some new questions, and maybe something to discuss for us. So first of all, the basis for my research is quite simple. It starts with a triangle, and at the left bottom, I would put the knowledge that we now have. Many scientists have confirmed and have shown and demonstrated that parasites are crucial for ecology and for the ecosystems in which they live. If you take parasites out of an ecosystem, it's quite likely that the ecosystem collapses. Next to that, we also know now that many parasite species are threatened with extinction for various reasons, and I'll come back to that too. But my initial thought was, well, if we know this, if we know that they are so important ecologically and that they're threatened with extinction, and we look at the laws, the convention, for example, on nature conservation, then my thought was, well, then we should consider the position and even the legal protection of these parasites, because we had these conventions, these treaties have as an objective to protect nature or conserve nature, whatever exactly that means. But if we know that parasites play a crucial role in that, and that they're threatened with extinction, then there should be perhaps a place for these species in these laws. So that's the starting point. Now, obviously, the first question is, what exactly are parasites? And so I make some decisions here. First of all, I mean, there are four conditions, four requirements for a species to be called a parasite. I only study animal parasites, so parasitic animals. Obviously, that's only part of the big picture, because parasites are not a taxonomic class, it's a lifestyle, like predation or scavengers. Or in some other classifications, you can also include herbivores. But parasitism is a lifestyle, and parasites therefore occur among animals, among fungi, among plants, and also among microorganisms, of course, bacteria as such. Now, I only look at animals for the reason of feasibility, because I cannot study everything. And if I'm going to study law and parasites, but I constantly also have to look at fungi and animals, etc., then 4 years is nowhere near enough to write anything decent. So I focus on animals, and I also do that because a big part of the ecological literature that I use, not all of it, but quite a lot of it, makes the same distinction. So there's a group of parasitologists specialized in parasitic animals, and this is a very different group from, for example, microbiologists or parasitologists looking at fungi or plants. So that's one restriction I make. It's artificial, but I'm quite happy I made that choice just for the feasibility. Then parasites live in or on a host. Now this is so this shows that parasitism comes with a certain intimacy with the host, or if you like, the prey. Um, um, and of course, the question is, well, where does it stop? What is intimate enough to be a parasite? The literature that I follow in this is that parasitism is defined at the life stage. So that means a parasite, even if it has a complex life cycle, meaning it metamorphizes into different stages, life stages, for each life stage, it needs one host, no more. A tick only needs one host for one stage, and then once it's succeeded that, it can move on to its next phase. Now, and this distinguishes the tick from the mosquito, for example. A mosquito, as we all know, attacks continuously without going to a new life stage, without anatomically changing, transforming. So we call, or they, in the literature, they call mosquitoes micro-predators. They're predators, although they do not kill their prey. So parasites live in or on a host for a certain amount of time, and this may be their entire life, or just a relatively short phase, which is enough for them to proceed to a next life stage. Then parasites consume part of their host. That's, yeah, I think quite obvious what I'm trying to say there. But it does also distinguish, because this means, for example, the cuckoo bird is excluded. We can call that a parasite. It does brood parasitism. It puts her egg, it lays her egg in the nest of a different species. But it's not a biological parasite in the sense that I consider in my research. Same can be said of social parasitism. I know there are some ant species that more or less invade in a different colony or different population of a different ant species and more or less take the benefit of that. But they are not parasites that I look at. And then finally, parasites are harmful for their host. Again, if you eat your host, obviously it's harmful. But it's useful to point out that harm is a very abstract. This is harm in a very abstract way. So this can be death, but it can also be tiny, imperceptible almost. Like, again, like a tick that eats, that consumes on one drop of blood. If you're lucky or unlucky, you don't even notice that you've got a tick. Of course, in an abstract way, it's still harmful because your body needs to reproduce that blood or defend or whatever. It's also useful to point out that the harm element means that parasitism is always beneficial for the parasite and harmful for the host. And there it differs from mutualism, where there's an interaction that is beneficial for both involved actors, and commensalism, where it's beneficial for one and not, let's say, it's neutral for the other. It's not harmful nor beneficial. So parasitism always comes with harm for the host and benefit for the parasite. So just some examples of the species or categories of species that I talk about, some slightly nasty pictures on the, these are all ectoparasites, so they are the parasites that live on the host. So on the left top, you can see the tick, and then clockwise you can see the leech, a louse, a mite, which has, like the tick, has 8 legs and it's related to the spider, I believe, and then the flea. And these are all endoparasites, so that means they're parasites that live in the host. And I need to see, I always confuse these. The left top is the roundworm. It's called a nematode. Then you've got the tapeworm in the center, cestode, and then on the right top, particularly nasty one, it's the larva of a botfly. So that one turns into, transforms into a fly, and then it's no longer a parasite. But I also consider the species that have at least one parasitic life stage. Then the crab, you see that blob thing is a saculina. It's actually all inside this crab, and it grows so large that at some point it cracks open the crab and it replaces the reproductive organ. It's a really, really nasty and fascinating story if you're into that sort of thing. And then on the left bottom, there's the flatworm, which is also called a fluke or a trematode. So these are just some examples of the species and the categories of species that I talk about. Right. So what makes these species important in an ecological way? So I'm going to do this by this quote from one of the core articles that helps me to make sense of all of this. Wait, to make this, yeah. So the quote is, many parasites play critical roles in ecosystems by contributing to biomass flow, food web connectivity, and population control, and by driving the evolution of other species. So I'm just going to briefly break down these 4 elements. So the food web connectivity, ecologists make food webs of ecosystems. Food webs help, they map all the consumers in the food web, and it shows who eats whom, basically. And when you add parasites to that, and I mention that because often this doesn't happen, probably also because it's not so easy to make sense of all these parasites. But when they succeed in doing that, it shows that parasites are everywhere in the food web. So they connect many species with each other because parasites eat and they get eaten either intentionally or unintentionally. If a predator eats a prey, it's quite likely, it's probably inevitable that it also eats the many parasites that the prey hosts. So for a food web, this makes the whole thing so much more complex, and it adds many new parts in the available food chains. But it's not just who eats whom, but it's also the amount of biomass or energy that they account for. Because parasites are with many, they're with huge numbers. And the numbers are so big that actually, if you treat them as one category, you can easily compare them, or they can even match categories of other species, such as the top predators, etc., etc. So we're talking about huge numbers of kilos or energy. And so this happens directly for the reasons that I just explained. They get eaten and they eat. So this creates a flow of biomass, but also indirectly because parasites force hosts to adapt. Adapt in the sense that they're careful with what they eat, They eat less, they eat more to avoid parasites. Um, they are careful with who they mate with. Um, uh, an individual that is pestered with parasites has probably less chance of finding uh, a mate than a healthy-looking individual. Um, Probably the same with humans, actually. Um, they also force hosts to recover once they are infested with parasites, which again costs a lot of energy that they cannot use for reproduction, for for finding food or hunting or whatever. So there are many strategies that potential host species have and attend to in order to avoid or cope with parasites. And obviously, this all costs a lot of energy, which on a larger scale has an effect on the biomass flow in ecosystems. And therefore, parasites also affect the populations of species. Um, if a species overgrows the ecosystem, parasites sometimes manage to control the population or to let other populations flourish too. And this also results sometimes in the notion of the keystone parasite, in line with the keystone species of an ecosystem, in which you can see that the presence of one parasite species affects an entire ecosystem. Sometimes a parasite can even be an ecosystem engineer, like certain plants or beavers, physically altering an ecosystem. Let's see. Yeah, so all in all, I like this quote: host diversity begets parasite diversity. So, in different words, to put it differently, parasites are part of biodiversity and uh, they need each other. Hosts and parasites, um, it's essentially it's the same source of life, maybe. And then something more about evolution, um, because obviously not a single host is ever happy to host parasites. But on a larger scheme of things, parasites and hosts, they force each other also to evolve. Hosts are constantly they're constantly evolving to adapt and to better um, live with parasites. And parasites then respond to, again, evolving. So it's a constant race. And therefore, it's also been suggested that species with poor parasite fauna are less resistant to new parasites or new diseases, for example, through invasive alien species. So, on a larger scheme, in bigger timescales, parasites are also crucial for the persistence of species that they actually parasite themselves. Okay, and oh yeah, I want to picture this, visualize this by a beautiful study in Japan. This is the Japanese trout. It's an endangered species, and a team of researchers did a lot of study into this species to see how they could get it into better shape as a species. So what they found is that the trout loves eating crickets. If the crickets are available, the crickets provide 60% of the annual intake of the trout in terms of calories. So this is a huge portion of its diet. But the interesting thing is that the crickets do not live in the water, they live on the land. And obviously the trout does not get on land. So the researchers wondered, how does this work? How does the trout gets the cricket? And so they started studying and observing the crickets. And they saw that every now and then a cricket would walk next to the water and suddenly jump into it which is odd because they can't swim, so it's more or less suicide. And then, of course, it was food for the trout. But this happens regularly, predictably. And so they wondered how. So they dissected, they intersected a number of these crickets, and they discovered that the crickets were filled with larvae of horsehair worms, nematodes, as you can see here. This is, of course, when the worm leaves the cricket. And so they started studying the worms. And here it gets interesting because the worms, they have a complex life cycle. So as larvae in the water, they get eaten by invertebrates at the bottom of the creek. And then at some point, these invertebrates with the larvae inside, they go on land and there they die. So the crickets, they are scavengers and they eat the dead invertebrates with the living larvae inside. And that's how the larva gets into the cricket. And there it develops into a worm, but then it needs to get back into the water because that's the life cycle it follows. And so what they do is they manipulate the brains of the cricket. So at some point, the cricket, well, decides, if you can call it that, to jump into the water. And then it gets eaten, of course, and the worm leaves the cricket and the trout, and it continues its life cycle. So there are at least two reasons why this story is relevant. First, I think the cricket, and therefore the presence of the worm, more or less keeps the trout species away from extinction. With 60% of its diet, that's a vast amount. And second, and you can see that here, on the left part of the picture, the crickets are not available for the trout. The horsehair worm is not available and the crickets are not available. And then what the trout does is it eats the invertebrates. The problem then is that the invertebrates can no longer eat the dead algae and the dead leaves that they normally feed on. So the entire water, the creek, and therefore the entire ecosystem gets filled with dead leaves, and it changes the entire ecosystem. On the right side of the picture, you can see what happens, like in the story I just told, with the horsehair worm present. There's this whole cycle which I've just explained, and you can see how this even connects the aquatic ecosystem with the terrestrial ecosystem. And it, apparently also keeps the water clean, and it gives something to eat for the trout, etc., etc. So here I think you can safely say that the horsehair worm is something of a keystone parasite, providing many services in a way to the ecosystem. Okay, then we get to the question, why are they actually threatened with extinction? So the IPBES, I think we all more or less know what that is, describes 5 major categories or major drivers for biodiversity loss. First is climate change or global warming. And each of these, by the way, has also big implications for parasite extinction. So parasites as a group apparently are one of the most perceptible to climate change. And I'm not going into a lot of detail here, but I think it makes sense. They're so depending on their environment and their hosts that small changes can disrupt these complex interactions. And this happens a lot. Temperature changes on land or in the water, different, composition of, for example, the sea or rivers, makes them very vulnerable to global warming as such. Pollution, same story. eutrophication or ocean acidification, which are direct consequences of pollution, affect parasites at quite a large scale, as of course do pesticides, sometimes intentionally, often unintentionally. Yeah, it's probably not surprising that as invertebrates, these parasites do not go very well with pesticides. Although there are some parasites which apparently do too well with certain pesticides, and then they're the only ones that are left, which is also problematic, of course. Land use change, well, again, if the environment that they live in gets degraded or even entirely changed or demolished, this is problematic for these species that are also dependent on ecological interactions and biological interactions. Invasive alien species, some parasites are, of course, invasive alien species themselves, but that does not mean that all the parasites cannot be harmed by this. Again, it depends on these interactions that they have with other species, and anything that disrupts the interaction is detrimental for the parasite. And the more complex the lifestyle of certain species is, the more dangerous any small change can be. So, for example, some invasive alien species could be useful hosts, and so the parasites go to that species. But then it turns out that actually it doesn't work. Parasites can't live off these hosts because the host is stronger at resisting the parasite. Or they are useful hosts, but they do not lead the parasite to the next host. Again, so then the story stops there. Or they eat the real host so that the parasite doesn't have any host left, etc., etc. So these are all all these options happen, and some of them are already observed, others are more theoretical. And then there's even something with exploitation. Obviously, it's not the biggest threat for parasites because exploitation implies a certain demand, and not many humans are very interested in the exploitation of parasites for whatever reason. But there are examples, for example, the medicinal leech, which I think was also in one of the pictures. It has pharmaceutical potential, and so as a result, they are now endangered in some areas where there used to be many, because they just get caught and transported. But this is obviously not one of the biggest threats for parasites. Then there are two additional threats that I want to mention. One is co-extinction. If the host goes extinct, so does the parasite, to put it simply. It's a bit more complex than that. Sometimes they can survive with other hosts. Sometimes they go extinct before the host goes extinct. But I think you can see how, especially for parasites, for that lifestyle, co-extinction is a substantial threat. And finally, conservation-induced eradication is what I call it. And I want to show you a small story of that. This is the California condor, and in 1987, I think it was, there were only 17 left, 17 individuals, and so in the wild. And so they decided to catch all of them and subject them to a breeding program. Now, this has been a great success because now there are about 400 in the wild. But my interest in this is that they knew at that point that there is a host-specific louse named the California condor louse, which you can see on the right, which only parasitizes the condor. They knew this. And when they caught the last condor, they, again, like all the others, they gave it a delousing treatment. So they picked out all the lice, and that was that. That was the end of the California condor louse. Now, this was my story. Unfortunately, for my story, since a couple of months, it seems that this louse still exists, which in a way is good news, but not for my story. So I haven't mentioned it in my paper because I know that they're working on this study right now. But the logic and the dynamics of my story, I think, are still valid in the sense that they did not care, at least, about the fate of this other species. The action that they did, as far as they could know, they ended an entire species for the benefit of another species. So yeah, so far it seems to work out fine, but it's actually a big risk what I have done back then, because again, a species with almost no parasites is likely, at least in some generations, to become very vulnerable for a new parasite or a new bacteria, etc., etc. So far so good, but they certainly took a big risk, and who knows what happens if some new invasive parasite turns up. Who knows what happens with this condom? Okay, let's see. Yeah. Then finally, I'm going to take a look at the law. So I studied, my colleague Ari Trauborst always speaks of the big five, the five big international conventions that have as their objective to conserve or protect nature in one way or another. And these are the five. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, CITES, the Convention on Migratory Species, the Ramsar Convention, and the World Heritage Convention. And I looked at these five to see how they treat parasites and if they give any potential for perhaps some sort of a legal protection of these animals. So the CBD as a starting point is interesting because their definition of biodiversity is very broad. It includes all forms of life and therefore also parasites. Parasites are as much part of biodiversity as any other form of life, in principle. They're also components of biodiversity, and components is mentioned in Article 7A, and this perhaps even qualifies parasites, or at least the threatened parasites and the ecologically important parasites, to be prioritized for conservation efforts under this convention. Of course, the convention is very broad and very holistic in its character. And so I also plowed through all the COP decisions. And there you can actually see a lot less potential in the sense that there are very few mentions of parasites. And the ones that I did find were mostly negative. So parasites were mentioned as threats for pollinators or as invasive alien species or in the context of agriculture. Of course, these mentions are all sound and valid. My point is, of course, that the other part of the story, what I have just explained, the fact that they are important, that is never really mentioned in any of the COP decisions. So in that sense, it's not in line with the findings of ecological parasitology, as this scientific discipline is called. CITES, well, there probably you would not expect anything useful because it's a trade agreement. Again, it addresses exploitation, and parasites are not really the first category to think of in terms of exploitation and illegal trade. However, there are 31 parasite animal species in the appendices of CITES. Two are the medicinal leech and another leech which is almost identical but not quite, so they're both listed. And then there are 29 freshwater mussels from North America, which all have a very short juvenile stage of small parasites when they parasitize, when they live on the gills of fish. Now, I don't think that they are listed because people trade these juvenile parasites, but to be complete, I have, of course, included them because they do have a parasitic life stage before they get their beautiful shells, which make them interesting for trade. So, yeah, I don't think CITES has the real potential here. I don't think we have to aim for CITES as the big saver of parasites. But it's interesting that actually CITES is the one with the biggest amount of parasites listed, because the Convention on Migratory Species has no parasites listed, and only one invertebrate, which is the monarch butterfly. Now, this may seem to make sense, but if you look at the definition of what a migratory species is in terms of CMS, it's actually quite surprising because they use a very broad definition that does not focus on biological migration, but on migration in terms of jurisdiction. So any species that predictably and cyclically crosses a jurisdictional border is considered a migratory species. And that means that, for example, any parasite that lives in a bird, a migratory bird, is potentially a migratory species for CMS. Because it certainly crosses jurisdictional borders, I'd say. And it does it predictably and cyclically. And its life may even depend on it, depending on its life cycle. So given that broad definition, I think it is a bit surprising that CMS does not ever mention parasites in any context. Then we've got two, so there's the Ramsar Convention and the World Heritage Convention, which both look not just at, they don't look at species protection, but at habitat protection. Now here, I think it would make sense to think of parasites as well, because as we now know, parasites constitute essential components either of wetlands or of natural sites of outstanding universal value. For example, the Dutch Waddenzee, it's been selected for its biodiversity. That's what makes it so special, at least as a natural heritage site. But studies show that this is partly due to the parasite richness and diversity in the Waddenzee. Without these parasites, the ecosystem would be considerably less rich and diverse, and therefore special and unique. But both of these conventions rarely ever mention parasites. The World Heritage Convention doesn't mention any, and there are a couple of mentions in some documents of the Ramsar Convention, but very much on the side. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so those are my first findings. And of course, my conclusion at the end of this in my paper is that I believe the protection of parasites should at least be considered in the context of these treaties. And currently, this does not happen at all. So, of course, there are various reasons for this, which I also look into in later parts of my PhD project. But my main argument here, as a starting point, is that neglecting about half of all animal species. Oh, yeah, I did not say that. About half of all animal species is parasitic. So this is really a huge, huge number of species. And neglecting all of these, just like that, I think makes up for a major gap in international biodiversity law. And I'm not suggesting that we should tomorrow start with setting up the International Convention on Parasite Conservation or anything like that. But I do think that there should be some consideration of this uh, such an important category of life. So from this, of course, the question is, okay, so what's next? How to continue from here? I think there are two ways, two strands for further research. One is to study international biodiversity law for the sake of parasite conservation, which is basically what I've started with here. So if we want to improve this, if we want to stop this potential uh, um, extinction wave of parasites, then how can these laws and other biodiversity law help? Um, that's one, and I think there is some potential in the existing conventions, but at the same time, there's much to be done. And I think, for example, collaborations between science and law, scientists and legal researchers may lead to interesting things. And I think especially about the relatively new working group on parasites under the IUCN, which also makes the red list. These are starts. This is a start of perhaps new things. I think there are many opportunities to be explored. And the other strand would be to take what I have learned from other literature, a parasite-centric view. So to look at international biodiversity law from the parasite. What does it tell us about these treaties, about this law? I think it raises questions, many questions, for example, about the species bias. Actually, in particularly, it's always related to the species bias, I think. Which species do we know and which one do we not know? And how does it affect our legal regime? And obviously, which ones do we like enough to protect? Well, clearly not parasites. And this you can also talk about this in more biopolitical terms. What do we let live or make die? So the death of one individual for the life of another, or even the extinction of an entire species for the persistence of another species. These are, I think, relevant questions in the context of parasite conservation. But I'm sure there are many more questions that I haven't thought of yet, and maybe you do now. So I'm very curious to hear that. Finally, my question for you, I'd be very interested to hear more about is, as I see it, of course, I look at ecology, nature conservation, biodiversity, and it seems you are more into the animal law side of these things. Now, I think, I hope, and I'm convinced that at the end of the day, we share more than than we might differ. We care about similar things, I'd say. But I can also imagine that my story about parasite conservation may have hit a nerve, and if it has, I really want to know more about that. So yeah, tell me anything that you feel or think after this presentation. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention.